Hello, everyone. This is the 10th in my ongoing series on YouTube that I've titled Views of Death and Afterlife in the Ancient Western World. This particular one is a bit different because I'm going to pause in terms of covering more new material and look back a little bit. I want to even problematize and complicate things a little bit to go a little bit deeper. This is almost like a Q&A kind of session, except I'm not having live people come on and ask questions. But I've assembled issues and questions that some of you have asked in the comments, and also some emails that I've gotten, as well as the typical kinds of things that I've discussed over the years when I've taught this subject as a college course. I would call this, if I gave it a title, and I will give it a title, Death and Afterlife, Tying Up Loose Ends with Some Caveats. I want to mention as I start, the painting behind me is by my late son, David. I mentioned him previously, and many of you commented on his work. This is one of my very favorites. It looks like, just on the face of it, some little tiny people dwarfed by the size of a forest alongside a river. But knowing David and his mystical approach to life, it could very well be appropriate for this very topic that we're discussing. The way the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, quoting the Robert Frost poem that many of us learned in grade school or even high school. Okay, death and afterlife, tying up some loose ends and some caveats. This is a AI picture that I put together just to capture this mystical feeling of the darkness of a cemetery, the mysteries, the night view, the moon rising, shedding some light over the greatest mystery of our existence. And that is, what's it all about, Alfie? And particularly, what happens when we die? It's one thing to ask about the future in terms of world history and the cosmos. That's certainly fascinating to me. But each of us individually face another question, as we all well know, long before the answers about our planet and its future and the cosmos are going to play themselves out. So let's take a look at these slides. I'm beginning with a question that I often get. It's all over the place on YouTube in different forms. It goes something like this. So, Dr. Tabor, do you believe in God or Jesus, or are you an atheist? I've always tried to say in all of my videos on YouTube that that question for me is irrelevant. I realize our personal views always affect the way we look at things, but I consider myself, as I say here, a historian of ancient Western religious traditions. In other words, I want to do a good job in describing to you, if I'm talking about the Gilgamesh epic or the Book of the Dead from Egypt, or a passage in Homer from the Odyssey, Book 11, any of these things, or anything in the Bible, to look at the languages, look at the text, to do a bit of study, even consultation with those in the field that know more than I do in certain areas. In terms of biblical materials, though, I feel pretty qualified to present some judgments. And so these are not personal judgments about, do I believe in God or Jesus, or am I an atheist? I really consider it irrelevant to what I want to do as a historian of religions. My focus is on the history of ideas across time and cultures. And I try to do that, of course, as objectively as I can. I'm well aware that no two historians agree, even on Abraham Lincoln, much less on Jesus of Nazareth or whether Moses even existed or anything of that nature. But we do have texts and we have methods of analysis, and we can look at religious, social, cultural, historical contexts. We can look at material evidence, which I do a lot in terms of the archaeological work that I've done. Here's the problem I find with these kinds of questions, although I realize why people are curious. I think any attempt to pigeonhole or slap labels on people ends up being more confusing than helpful. For example, just the way questions are phrased reflect assumptions about language and categories. They usually arise from a kind of a doctrinal checklist, this confessional idea that I could tick off. Tabor believes in God. Okay, what kind of God? And does he think the Bible's inspired and so forth? Here are a few questions that I often get. Do you believe in God? And if I were to answer that, I would have to answer with a question, as I would with all of these. What do you mean by God? It's a three-letter word. I often say it's dog spelled backwards because I'm such a lover of dogs. But what do you really mean by that? Was Jesus the Son of God, divine, the Messiah? Now, usually evangelical Christians ask this, and I know what they mean. I'm not ignorant of that. I grew up with it. But the idea of me giving a yes or no, what do you mean by Son of God? According to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, Adam is a son of God. And later, when Jesus talks about the future, he talks about people raised from the dead are sons of God, equal to angels. And I know what people mean, but the idea that it's just this static category. Divine, again, if humans are made in the image of God, are they divine? The Messiah, do you know that the Davidic figure in the Hebrew Bible is never even called the Messiah? And yet we're so confident about our language so that we can ask people, well, do you think Jesus was the Messiah? So I want to complicate things a little bit. Is the Bible the inspired word of God? All kinds of caveats about what do you mean inspired and so forth. Was Jesus raised from the dead? Many questions on that I've dealt with a little bit even in this series. So I hope you see the point of this particular slide. I want to try to clarify the ideas, and I even want to complicate the ideas, as I hope I can do in this particular segment. So let me go to a few texts. These are biblical texts, and I'm going to start with Job 19:23. This is a translation of the Jewish Publication Society Bible. I think it's a little more accurate than most of the Christian translators. And I've touched on this before, but I want to just begin with it again, because this line here about, I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end, outside my body, I will see God, and so forth. Many read this as a hint, if not an affirmation of Job, that there's life after death. But if you read the book of Job, you don't get off that easy. There's no answer in Job as to why he experiences all these sufferings and horrible events in his life. At the end, God basically says to Job, remember, in a whirlwind, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? Why are you even asking about the mysteries of the universe? But this passage is pretty clear. Job 19, beginning in 23. Job is talking to his friends, and they're assuring him that God is just, and none of this would have happened to him unless he deserved it somehow. And maybe his very sense of pride and self-righteousness were the reason. And Job says, no, I won't stand for that. I won't go with that. I disagree. And here's what he says. Oh, that my words were written down. Would that they were inscribed in a record, incised on a rock forever with an iron stylus and lead. He believes he's going to die, but he wants a record. And then he believes, and then my vindicator, my goel in Hebrew, literally my counsel for the defense. Somebody's going to come along and say, well, what about this character Job? If God is just, I mean, it looks like he got a really bad rap. And in the end, he will testify on earth. This after my skin will have been peeled off, but I would behold God while still in the flesh. What he's doing, according to this understanding, and the passage is difficult in Hebrew, but I lean toward this view of the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society rendering, that this is what he thinks is going to happen. His skin will be peeled off, but a vindicator will come if his words could be permanently written. And someday someone is going to say, Job was right. He did not deserve this. But what he wishes is I could behold God while still in my flesh. He wants to meet God, which he does at the end. I myself, not another, would behold him. Not another. In other words, I want to see God. I'd see him with my own eyes. My heart pines within me. Doesn't that make more sense? This is not about afterlife. This is about I'm going to die. I wish someone would write my case down so that later I could be vindicated in memory at least. But what I really want is to see God, to meet God. I want to talk to God. That fits the book perfectly. So let's go on. Here is Job 14. This is the view Job has of death and afterlife, even though he has the longing that he could somehow see God. For there's hope for a tree if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and its shoots will not cease. Though its root grow old in the earth, its stump die in the ground, yet at the scent of water it will bud and put forth branches like a young plant. So he's actually lamenting the fact that plants can seem to die, and in a drought, nothing seems to be left, and yet water comes and brings back life. Now, he doesn't think that's true with humans, but humans die. Man dies and is laid low. A man breathes his last. And where is he? Well, that's the question of the ages. What happens when you die? As waters fail from a lake and a river wastes away and dries up, so man lies down and rises not again. Till the heavens are no more, he will not awake or be roused out of his sleep. He does not have a view of resurrection of the dead at this point, and it's not in the Hebrew Bible in most of the parts. We're going to look at the two passages where you do have some idea that might be resurrection of the dead. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, and that you would conceal me until your wrath is past. So he thinks he's going to die in Sheol, and God's wrath will finally be over. But notice he wants God to appoint me a set time and remember me. So what he's doing here is longing for resurrection. Remember what we said about theodicy demands afterlife. As the biblical materials develop, the idea is justice and righteousness. This is the first time it ever is raised in the Bible, in the book of Job, in such an explicit way. If a man die, shall he live again? The answer is no, but it should be yes. You get the point? All the days of my service I would wait till my release should come. You would call and I would answer you. You would long for the work of your hands. Now, a lot of people believe in afterlife because of this very idea, that if God is just, no matter what the future is when we die, somehow there has to be something. God's going to remember us. He's going to somehow bring us forth. And of course, that is the idea that develops. But Job does not hold that view. He longs for that, but he never affirms it. Okay, let's go on. I want to show you the only two passages. This is a bit of a review, but we want to talk about them. One in Isaiah and the other in Daniel, where you do get a hint of maybe resurrection, not just a longing like in Job, but an actual hint that maybe this is coming. Now, the problem is this is in the Isaiah apocalypse. It's embedded in our book of Isaiah, chapter 24 through 28, but it doesn't have the vocabulary or the style of Isaiah as we know him in chapters 1 through 39. It certainly doesn't have the style of second Isaiah, 40 through 66, which we think might be from a different author. And whether it's from a different author or not, that's not the point here. So in chapter 26, you get this very interesting lament. Verse 13, O Lord, that's Yahweh, O Lord our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone we acknowledge. This is during the exile, maybe under the Assyrians or Babylonians, but like I said, we don't know exactly when to date this particular section of Isaiah. They are dead, they will not live. So this is not faith in general resurrection. These are the enemies that have ruled over Israel. They are shades. The word is Rephaim. It means shadows, just bare, weak inklings of what they once were. They will not rise. To that end, you visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. And that's the view of death and afterlife in the Hebrew Bible. In other words, the cultures that have conquered northern Israel and southern Israel, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they're gone. They'll be forgotten eventually. But then it goes on to say in verse 17, like a woman with child who rises and cries out in her pangs when she's near her time, so we were because of you, O Lord. In other words, the sufferings of Israel are like birth pangs of some sort of hope. This is what the author wants to be the case. We were with child, we ride, we have, as it were, brought forth wind. In other words, you're waiting for a baby to be born and you have all this hope, and then nothing comes from all the struggle. Again, you see the idea of the author is that can't be true. There's got to be something else. Yes, our enemies are dead, but we have suffered unjustly. We have gone through the birth pangs of suffering. And what did it really yield? Wind. We have wrought no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. So, life goes on. But then you get in verse 19, thy dead, plural, thy dead ones shall live. And then it says, my body, they will rise. And so the singular plural doesn't work literally. So most translations put their bodies, they shall rise, because that seems to be what it says. But literally, it's like my dead carcass. So maybe this is just some sort of textual corruption. There are lots of places in the Hebrew Bible where we're not really sure what it means, and maybe some of the letters have gotten confused or something. But taking it as it is, literally, it seems to say there's no hope, but your dead will live. My carcass, they will rise. Almost like an insertion, my carcass, my dead body, they will rise, meaning I'll rise, they'll all rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light, and on the land of the shades you will let it fall. So if light falls in the darkness of Sheol, this implies maybe some kind of resurrection. You also have the banquet that we talked about, where God swallows up death and wipes away all tears. But, and that's in this section too, that doesn't necessarily say that the dead will come forth. It might mean, in its context, that there'll be death no more in the future. It'll be over. But this seems to say that no, those who've died are going to come forth from the dead. And then the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, seems to be a pretty clear statement of a terrible time of trouble, of suffering, similar to the sentiment of Isaiah 26. But multitudes of those who sleep in the dust will awake, And notice they're sleeping in the dust still. They're in Sheol. Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So here you're beginning to get the idea that it's not just the righteous God's people who are raised from the dead and vindicated, but also the wicked have to pay for their sins. So they also get raised, some to shame and contempt. Now it does say many or multitudes, whether it means all or this is a beginning idea that, the really, really righteous should somehow come back and be rewarded, and the really, really wicked need to come back and be punished. And maybe the rest just remain in Sheol because their lives don't fall in either category. It's hard to know. And those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Now, here are some passages that people read often out of context, and they decide that these passages mean there is afterlife in the Hebrew Bible. And if you look at them in context, they really don't say that. The only ones are the ones I just looked at, Isaiah 26 and Daniel 12. But poetically, you can have things like this. Whither shall I go from your spirit? This is a Psalm of David, at least it's attributed to him, and he's talking to God. How can I get away from your spirit? It's about the presence of God. Or whither shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. Now, there's nothing really in anything we know about David going to heaven. So he's imagining this God that fills heaven and earth. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. So whether I go down or up or horizontally, even then your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall uphold me. That is not about afterlife. That's about the presence of God in the universe. It could lead to the idea of afterlife, but it's essentially taken out of context to apply it that way. This one, Psalm 16, is quoted in the book of Acts by Peter and just completely misapplied, because he says that David wrote this as a prophecy of Jesus, how he would die and his flesh would not see corruption, and he's the Holy One of God. And he goes on to say, David, who wrote this, is dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day in Jerusalem, and therefore he couldn't be talking about himself. Again, totally out of context. Psalm 16 is attributed to David, but it's talking about how God's presence is with him, similar to the one here. But the idea that even when you face dire straits or disease or great suffering, the Lord is always before me because he's at my right hand. I will not be moved. Therefore, my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body dwells secure. He's not dead here. He's saying God is going to save him. You will not give me up to Sheol. In other words, you're not going to let me die. You won't let your godly ones see the pit. You will show me the path of life, and in your presence there's fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So he's facing death, but he's assured that that will not happen, that God is going to lift him up and save him. This is very similar, the context, to Jonah 2. Jonah is swallowed by the fish, and in the belly of the fish, he's on the brink of death. He's entered the bars of death, you might say. He uses that term. And he says, I called to the Lord out of my distress. He answered me. Now, he basically saved his life out of the belly of Sheol. So the fish is like a tomb. He's almost dead, but with his last breath, he cries out, and God heard his voice. You did cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas. The flood was round about me. All your waves and billows passed over me. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you did bring up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. I guess you could call it a near-death experience, but this is clearly the context again. These are not about life after death. These are not about resurrection from the dead. They're about the presence of God and the love of God and the care of God. The very first Psalm, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, meaning continually is the Hebrew word. All the days of my life. It's got a context. So what people do is they read these out of context. They try to Christianize them. That's what's done in the book of Acts with this one. This is not about Jesus. It has nothing to do with Jesus. Now, could you take these ideas and shape them into a new meaning? Of course. That's how people do exegesis. But I'm talking about these texts when they were written in their ancient Near Eastern context were not affirming life after death. Now, what about exceptions in the Hebrew Bible? Look, Sheol is Sheol, whether it's spoken of literally as the state of the dead or figuratively, like sleeping in the dust, making one's bed in Sheol. Sheol is Sheol throughout the Hebrew Bible. So even though you do have these three examples that people assume are exceptions, it's not so clear. What we read in Genesis about Enoch, and remember, he just becomes legendary, and we have the books of Enoch. First Enoch, the Ethiopian version that we have is 5 different parts or books, and then you've got Second Enoch and Third Enoch and all kinds of legends of Enoch. If you go to Genesis 5, verse 24, it simply says, Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. Doesn't say where he took him, like to heaven. Doesn't say that he didn't see death. The book of Hebrews interprets it that way. So when people read this, they read it with Hebrews 11, verse 5 in mind, that Enoch walked with God and he did not see death, and that he was lifted up to God. And therefore, people talk about Enoch went to heaven. Doesn't say that. Now, Elijah, Enoch and Elijah are the 2 exceptions that people always ask about. He does go in a whirlwind up to heaven, traveling in God's chariot, maybe to another place. The chronicler in 2 Chronicles 21:12 has Elijah sending a letter to King Jehoram, who's married to Jezebel's daughter, by the way. And this is way after he supposedly was taken to heaven. So here's somebody writing of in that time, not contemporary with Elijah, but subsequently retelling the story. And they're not reading it like that. They're just reading it as he disappeared. Now, later, of course, in the Gospel of Mark, for example, it gets expanded into that kind of idea. Mark 9, when Jesus is transfigured or glorified, and Peter, James, and John see him in that glorified state. You also have Moses and Elijah appearing in heavenly glory, because in the Second Temple period, these stories had grown up that Enoch, Elijah, Moses have all been taken up to heaven. But those are certainly not the views of the ancient texts. They're the views that develop, just as views develop today. Then you've got the famous story about the Seance, where King Saul, wants to call up Samuel when Samuel has died and gone to Sheol. There's no question that Samuel is in Sheol, because when he's brought up, and this could just be a kind of a vision or even something that a medium was able to cause to happen, she's looking into some kind of probably a basin of water, and Saul goes, "What do you see? What do you see?" And she says, "I see a God, an Elohim coming up out of the earth." And there's some sort of a mighty one. And he says, "What does he look like?" He said, "He's an old man wrapped in a robe." And Saul decides it's Samuel. And he bows his face to the ground and does obeisance. And then Samuel says to Saul, it's not clear, does Saul hear this? Or does the woman say, "He just said to you, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" So again, the dead in Sheol are not pictured as non-existent. And the idea of the spirits of the dead somehow maybe chirping and making noises as they're made fun of in the book of Isaiah, that they kind of chatter and peep like little birds. They're of no account. This is a common view in the ancient world about the dead. They have no power, they have no ability to really take things over. So those are the so-called exceptions in the Hebrew Bible. Look, Sheol is Sheol. And even when you go to the New Testament, you're going to see the view generally holds up. So what about the New Testament? So let's take a look at this Luke 16:22 following. The story Jesus tells, a poor man dies and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. So he's dead, but he's in the presence of Abraham. And remember, the presence of Abraham is in Sheol, the world of the dead. And the rich man also dies and is buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifts up his eyes. And so he's in Hades, and metaphorically at least, he lifts his eyes and he sees Abraham afar off, also in Hades, in the world of the dead. And Lazarus is in his bosom. So, to take this literally, absolutely literally, seems a little silly. But the idea that when people die, they're not without existence, and they experience their time in Sheol or Hades in different ways. Some are comforted and some are tormented. And he asked if Father Abraham can send Lazarus back to the world. He's not in heaven, he's in the world of Hades, to his father's house, because he has 5 brothers and he wants to warn them lest they come into this place of torment. And then the rich man says, yes, but if someone goes from the dead, they'll repent. So see, he's talking about coming up from the dead. So this is not about heaven or anything like that. It's mythologizing the states of different individuals in Hades. And then Abraham ends the story by saying, nope, even if someone rose from the dead, they would not be convinced if they're not hearing Moses and the prophets. Well, Moses and the prophets never speak about afterlife. Interesting, really. I guess you could say, well, what about Isaiah 26 and Daniel 12? But I think as a general statement, Abraham is not wanting to use in this story resurrection as proof of some kind of warning for the living. The living need to take heed to what God has revealed. Then you've got also in Luke, and these are both in Luke, one of the insurrectionists who's crucified with Jesus. Remember, the two usually called thieves, but the word is really someone who Josephus calls a rebel, an insurrectionist. And Mark refers to the insurrection that had happened around that time with Barabbas. And so these are apparently 2 others that are crucified with Jesus. It's usually translated when Jesus says to the man, saving him before he dies, truly I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise. He forgives his sins. The man repents. And the other man, remember, makes fun of Jesus and taunts him and says, if you're the Son of God, you need to save us all and come down from the cross. But this one guy apparently is accepted in this story. So you'll be with me in paradise. Well, here, paradise probably is just this blessed state of the dead in Hades. And it's a compartment of Hades. It could be punctuated differently, and I'm not saying it should be, just to think about this. Truly, I say to you today, in other words, Jesus would be saying, on the cross, at the moment of our death today, I'm going to tell you, you'll be with me in paradise, referring to the resurrection of the dead in the future. So, these do not overthrow the general view of resurrection of the dead. Okay, so let's go to some texts in the New Testament. This one is often quoted by people, out of context, of course. If you remember the context in chapter 5, it's about dying, getting stripped naked, your soul, and then getting a new body permanently. So it's about the future resurrection. In the meantime, this is verse 6. So read the first 5 verses and then read verse 6. So we are always of good courage because we have faith in resurrection of the dead. That's the context. People just quote it without even looking it up. We know that while we are at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. Well, that's true. For we walk by faith, not by sight. We are of good courage. We would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Paul thinks when you die, you're asleep. Those who sleep, the dead in Christ, who've fallen asleep. So they are in the presence of the Lord. They're home. And their next waking moment will be to rise and meet Christ, as Paul says, in the air. So whether we're at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, and that's at the end. So this is about dying before the end, being at home in the keeping of the Lord, because you've got the promise, the Lord here is Jesus, that he's going to bring you forth from the dead. So again, you can't read these out of context. If you read them in context, they're very powerful metaphors. Revelation 20 goes with this, the judgment seat, a great white throne, the dead, small and great, do come forth from Hades, all the dead that are in the sea. Hades gives up the dead and then they are judged. So this is what Paul's talking about. He often talks about the judgment seat of Christ, where you'll be judged for what you've done in the body, how faithful you've been, even as a Christian or a follower of Jesus. This one is often quoted again to have the idea that when you die, you go to heaven if you're a Christian. For to me, this is Philippians 1:21, for to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. If it is to be life in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet what I shall choose, I cannot tell. Paul is in prison when he writes this letter, and some have thought it's Caesarea where he was imprisoned, according to the book of Acts. Others think it's all the way in Rome under Nero. But he says, I don't know what to choose. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better, because life is suffering. So he'd rather be with Christ. Christ, according to Paul, fills heaven and earth. So if you're sleeping in Jesus, as some tombstones say, asleep in Jesus, you've left the body and you're with Christ. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. So he's basically just saying he's probably older at this point. He's had a lot of sufferings. It would be easy just to let go and be in the presence of Christ, to rest in Christ until the end. Now, here's another one, same book, that makes it very clear that he's talking about the last days and resurrection of the dead. For his sake, I've suffered the loss of everything, and I count them as a refuse. Everything that he's given up, he says, it's just like garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own based on the Torah, but that which is through faith in Christ. This is Paul's basic message, the righteousness of God that depends on faith, Romans 3. Notice, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that if possible, I may attain the resurrection of the dead. So you see there, he's still talking about at the end, when the dead are raised, will it be possible for him to attain the resurrection? And then in the same chapter, for our commonwealth is in heaven, and from it we await a savior. This is at the end, the parousia, when Jesus returns, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will change our lowly body to be like his glorious body. I'm telling you, Paul is absolutely consistent. In my book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, I discuss all of these ascent texts, as I've mentioned before, And I do consider the possibility, and I'm not convinced of it, that maybe Paul has been told when he was taken up to heaven that when you die, you're going to get raised up immediately. But I really don't think if you read this entire chapter, chapter 1 and then chapter 3, especially with this verse, I think he expects not to have some special resurrection like Jesus did, but Christ, he says, was the first fruits, then those who belong to him at his coming. He says that in 1 Corinthians. So I don't think he's changed his mind here. Now, look, this is often mistranslated and misread. This is where people get really confused. They say that someone has departed to be with Christ as if they've gone to heaven and already got their new body. And that's not what these texts say. But in 1 Thessalonians 4, but we would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning those who are asleep. These are members of the Christian community that have died. That's why when you translate, if you translate it died, it's going to be very misleading because they could have died and gone to heaven, but they haven't. They're asleep. You sleep in the dust, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Notice, the hope is not immortality of the soul. Otherwise, these others who have no resurrection hope wouldn't grieve. They would be like Socrates, cheerfully drinking the hemlock and going to be with God. But Paul says that if you don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, there is no afterlife. Everybody stays in Sheol. That's his view. And have perished, he uses that word, 1 Corinthians 15, we covered that. So you're not to grieve. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again from the dead out of Sheol, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him. Now here, the word is ago. In Greek, it means go, lead, or bring. And it clearly means God will bring forth the dead. They've fallen asleep, and he will bring forth the dead from the state of being dead. That's the idea. He will lead them, ago, lead them forth in a triumphal ascent to heaven. And then he tells you, this we declare to you by the word of the Lord. We who are alive, he thinks he will be alive, and who are left until the coming of the Lord shall not precede those who've fallen asleep. So the dead are dead, and they're waiting. And when the Lord appears, the dead will rise first. Then those who are alive will rise and be caught up together in the clouds and so forth. This is absolutely the same as 1 Corinthians 15. So I don't think there's any exceptions in the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible to this general view that death is death, it is not life, and life in this Jewish early Christian view is to come forth from the dead, and as Paul would say, with a new glorified body that'll be like the body Jesus had when he was raised from the dead. And that would be what we call apotheosis. The dead will be raised incorruptible. So nobody's interested in body parts, dead bodies, finding who died in the sea, or anything of that nature. I know it's not the hope that many receive in their Christian churches, but study the Bible. It is essentially the idea consistently in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. Now, let's complicate it a little bit. We went over these contrasts, and if you go down this list, remember, the creation's good, humans are living breathers, they're of the dust. This is definitely the Hebrew view. And I believe it's also essentially the view of somebody like Paul or somebody like Jesus, because even Jesus says in Luke, in his account in chapter 20, those who are worthy to attain to that age, the age to come. So it's at the end. And this is more the Hellenistic or the Greek view. And they do seem to be very different. But here's some cautions and caveats. I want to ask, how dualistic are Paul and Jesus? Now follow me here. Because once you add in a linear view of history, the beginning and the end of the age, with all of this happening at the end and the world disappearing and a new creation coming, is that very different from a heavenly world that you would leave this earth and go to a heavenly world? One is leaving here and going up to the heavenly world. The other is living your life and at the end being pulled up out of the dead and experiencing a heavenly world. In other words, I guess you could say heaven comes to earth, and that's what you get in the book of Revelation. The dwelling of God is with humans, and the way the new creation is pictured doesn't seem to be what we would call physical. It's totally transformed, and if people have new bodies, then they're in a new environment. That's pretty dualistic. So there is the vertical dualism where the world is a bad place, you've fallen, it's dark, you need to get out, you need to escape. But there's also a dualism that sees this world as ruled by Satan, as Paul says, that Satan is the God of this world. And it's a dark place ruled by the principalities and powers that bear down upon us. And he expects deliverance at the end of the age, but it still is an escape from the material world into some sort of new world. So Paul says things like, we don't look to Jerusalem below, we look to Jerusalem above, that is the mother of us all. That's in the book of Galatians. I don't think Paul ever hints that when you die, you're going to go up to Jerusalem above, but he does see this merging of this world and the world to come into this new spiritual world, so that the heavenly Jerusalem is what he's really looking for. But the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly will all be combined in this new age to come. Seems to be kind of his view. Also, the terms material and spiritual are probably misleading in the Hellenistic period. What generally is the cosmology of the Hellenistic world is the stuff down below is thick and heavy. It's material, but it's not different from what's above that becomes light and more airy and more immortal. So down here is dense, and it's the world of death and darkness. And as you move up, you pass higher and higher to the world of light and life. It's not the view that most people hold when they hear the word spiritual today and physical, as if we're talking about a dichotomy in physics, like physical is physics, gravity, the strong and weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, the four forces of physics, and the spiritual something else. In the Hellenistic world, it's not like that. It's one reality with graduations of experience. And as you move up, you get to something more refined and something more divine. And as you move down, you're in the chthonic world of the dead at the lowest level. So salvation is getting out. But if you turn that this way, you follow? Watch. Here's the heavenly light world. Here's the earthly. We turn it linear. Now here is history ruled by Satan, the God of the world, who's cast out. And then you enter into the heavenly. Is it really that different? Here I'm disagreeing with Kuhlman, or at least thanking Kuhlman for his insights, because I think they're very valuable. And much of what he writes, I would have to agree with. If you think of it the way I'm describing it now, either going up to have immortality and everlasting life and a new body, or going to the end of the age, is it time that's really the difference? And does time really matter? Isn't it really a kind of state of being? In other words, when you're at the lower level in Sheol or Hades, or when you're in this world, a creature, a breathing creature of dust, your state of being is death. You do not have eternal life. But if you enter into the new age, or you leave this world and enter into the heavenly world, then you are transformed. So it's really talking about maybe a state of being. So here's the final question for you. For Paul, think about it, is a spiritual body. He insists on a body. Remember, a body is your mode of being you, your mode of individuality, your mode of existence. It's not just ethereal vapor disappearing into the cosmos. You have an entity that you could call you. So Paul calls it a wind body, an air body. So is your air body that different from a glorified immortal soul? Apparently, Socrates believed that he, as a spiritual being, his immortal soul, would finally rise up to be with the gods in some sort of a heavenly dwelling. But you get the idea that he would still maintain his individuality. If that's the case, then there are really two views, broadly speaking. And, whenever you generalize, you have to be careful. There's the view that when humans die, whatever they were dissipates into the cosmos and is no more. However you want to explain that. Their brain waves, their thoughts, their experiences, their memory, whatever, it's gone. Or there's the view that somehow, either at the end of an age or in another realm, their individuality is preserved and immortalized so that they experience a life beyond death. Either way, you don't have it now. Now, the difference is, if I go back, there are differences for sure. You don't see in the Hebrew view the body as a prison of the soul. However, let me remind you, in Romans 7, Paul does speak of his moral struggles and failures as a follower of Jesus. And he says, the good that I would, I do not, and the evil that I would not do, I do. And then he goes on to say, but if I do what I would not, it's not I doing it, my inner redeemed self or my spirit. He says, he that is joined to Christ becomes one spirit with him, like a marriage. And then he quotes, for the two will become one flesh. So he who is joined to the Lord, liking it to a kind of a sexual union, almost a begetting of the Spirit. And he calls those who are begotten of the Spirit or children of God, so that his inner self does not want to sin. But then he says, so it's not, I'm not the one, Paul, that's doing it, but the flesh in which I dwell. Well, that's starting to sound, again, somewhat like Plato. So I think these dichotomies are worth looking at, especially in terms of valuing this world and accepting the reality of mortality and death. So there is something to be said for that. What is it to have a religion and a faith in God and a belief in God and a belief in a moral order, but then to be told that when you die, you are dead and you go back to the dust? It begs for something beyond, but it's not promised in the Hebrew Bible. Take care, everybody. Next time, we're going to go and talk about how the early Christian fathers began to so Hellenize the message of the New Testament, as Oscar Cullmann points out, that resurrection of the dead really comes to mean nothing. And it's basically eliminated in this original understanding.